right, I'm very excited to be here today with Steve Levine. He produced Culture Club's first 3 records, Kissing to Be Clever, Color by Numbers, and Waking Up with a House on Fire. And we're talking specifically today about Color by Numbers, which sold, I think, over 10 million copies now, something like that. I mean, and of course, it sold a lot initially. It's considered their most important album, I would say. And it was successful in both the UK and the USA and really all over the world. My personal feelings on this record, I mean, I love this record. I wouldn't have done an interview on it without that. I think it's kind of one of the glossiest sounding records of the 80s. Incredible vocals, very soulful, and excellent sound quality, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today, mostly because this is a producer's and an engineer's interview, as I like to do. A lot of people do stories about the making of the album and sort of the stories behind that in terms of the drama and everything. But I'm more interested on this channel in the production elements and some of the secrets that you were using back in that era. So first of all, I want to ask, how did you get chosen, Steve, to produce Culture Club initially?
It started initially because I produced the Angelic Upstarts, who were a post-punk, well, they were a punk band, but I produced their album in their post-punk era. And they were managed by Tony Gordon, who later became Culture Club's manager. And during the recording of that album, they were really pleased with the way the album was going. And it was also, if you think back to that timeline, it was just as drum machines were beginning to come in and some of the synthesizers were kind of upscaling a little bit. And I just bought the Linn drum myself, and I'd also bought a Korg Delta synth. So I used those to some degree with the approaches that the band wanted on that album. And then when both Tony Gordon and indeed their A&R guy heard what we were doing in the studio, he said, "This is, really love the sound you're trying to create here." And he then said to me, "Look, there's this kind of new band that I've sort of heard a few things about. Can I send John Moss, the drummer, down to see you and have a conversation? Because the way you're working on this, some of the thoughts that the band have could align." So I met John Moss initially, and we had a conversation just about sound and ideas, and John was very specific about a couple of really important things. And this was, I think, a pivotal moment in the conversation. For those that know, John Moss had previously been in a band called London, and he also had a period of time in Adam and the Ants. And as many people know, Adam and the Ants had 2 drummers. And 2 drummers, whilst it's great on record, is a nightmare for a recording engineer and a producer. And John was really also very keen, as George was at the time, on some of the Burundi beats that had appeared on Bow Wow Wow. Again, for those that know, George for a very short period of time was in that group as well. And so John Moss said to me, "Steve, is there a way of combining that kind of Burundi beat with a kind of, again, in the period of time it was, that sort of new age kind of dance music?" It wasn't pure disco by then because we'd moved forward. The mid 70s was the disco era, but by the late 70s, early 80s, disco music had taken on a new sound. A lot of synthesizers were being used. And I said, "Well, John, can I show you this? I've just bought this Linn drum machine." I said, "So we could, for example, program the basic beat to give you that kind of disco element, but then you could play live drums on top." Now, one thing that was really, I guess it's the hubris of youth. I said to John, "So we could do that?" And he went, "Yeah." Now, for those that don't know, doing that in theory, and this is well before any hard disk editing was invented, it's actually really hard unless the drummer is really, really good. And I obviously realized John was very good, but I didn't realize how good he was until I'd worked on many other acts later where they said, "Oh, we'd love to do that similar thing." And it sounded, quite frankly, like the drummer had thrown some cutlery down the stairs because it just wasn't tight. But John's natural rhythm and his ability to lock in with a programmed drum machine really was quite exceptional for the day. Now, a lot of drummers today, I've worked with lots of new drummers recently, drummers have improved over the last few years beyond all recognition, because they're so used to playing with pre-recorded loops or other drum machines or working directly on their own in their DAWs. So I'd say young drummers today are absolutely breathtaking in their, not only just their timing, but also their perception of rhythm. But John was exceptional and still is exceptional for that period. There were one or two drummers, Graham Broad, another drummer that I worked with, who was very similar. There were a few drummers that were absolutely incredible at that time when it was unique to be that good. And John was also very good about percussion. So with that in mind, we booked some studio time with Ashley Goodall at EMI Studio, and we recorded the 2 demos, which was White Boy and I'm Afraid of Me, with the hope that EMI would sign them. Unfortunately, they didn't. And so we went into this kind of strange period where we were just sort of, no one was really interested in the band, but we could see the band was really successful within their world. It's probably worth remembering also then, this is well before the internet, that if a band was really successful in London or another band was successful in Liverpool or Manchester, they all stayed very, very separate. What was going on in Liverpool didn't really reflect into Manchester, vice versa, and certainly didn't affect nearly 300 miles away in London. So it became the new wave sound, which is why I think it was so successful when it became the British invasion. Each type of band developed very much in isolation to every other band, but with a common energy and theme. And so that's why Spandau Ballet doesn't sound like Culture Club. Culture Club doesn't sound like Orchestral Manoeuvres or Echo and the Bunnymen or the Smiths or any. Everyone sounded really different, even though it's of a kind of encapsulated new wave of music. And I thought that was really interesting. That happens less now because everyone can hear everyone's work so quickly, and there's a lot more copying and emulation, which then the copying and emulation was very, very different. So that was the starting of the Culture Club sessions, if you like, those demos. But during the period between those sessions and then getting a deal with ultimately Virgin, we were in the studio as much as we could possibly do, working on demos and ideas. And during those sessions, some of the other great songs were written.
Okay, well, man, fantastic answer. Very interesting, very interesting. I want to talk next about Boy George's voice. I kind of consider him the British Smokey Robinson, something like that.
Well, that's a great comment, because not only that, I nearly worked with Smokey Robinson. I never actually ended up producing him. But I had a meeting with Smokey Robinson because he thought exactly the same thing. And he said to me, Steve, there's a touch of me in those records. And so I thought that was an enormous honor. I've interviewed Smokey myself for my own radio show, and he's an absolute darling of a man. I really, really love him. He's a real hero of mine, because people forget not only is Smokey a great singer, and a great writer, but he's also a great record producer. He's a record producer that's produced some fantastic records. So I love it that you've said that, because I completely agree, but it wasn't conscious. We didn't sit down and say, emulate Smokey. Just there was that slight touch of falsetto in George's voice, the higher quality that is reminiscent of those records. Of course, we all loved all the Motown catalogue, and indeed all the Philadelphia catalogue. So I'd also argue there's a tiny bit of Eddie Kendricks in there as well. There's maybe even a tiny bit of David Ruffin. We all loved all of those records, and as well as all the sort of things like David Bowie, Mark Bolan, those kind of 70s bands. So there's a mix of all the different sounds in there. And it was one, just as a small side, there was one great thing that obviously we all love David Bowie, but particularly young Americans. And for those that don't know, a very young Luther Vandross did the backing vocals on Young Americans. And many years later, when I was producing the Beach Boys, Luther Vandross was in the studio next door. And George came to see me at the studio a couple of times. And George has a great picture with him and Luther Vandross. Sadly, I took the picture, so I'm not in the picture because it was before selfies.
Right.
But yeah, so all those vocalists, George has admired his whole life, and we admired both from a performance point of view and also from a melodic point of view. I think one of the other parallels you may see with George on those records is it's melodically like those lovely Motown records. The melody takes you on a really nice journey.
Exactly. And I think there really weren't many British singers who were at that time, similar to Boy George. The only ones who I'm thinking of at the top of my head would be Mick Hucknall and then Alison Moyet.
But Mick was later. Alison was
later.
at the same time, but Mick was quite a bit later. Yeah.
Yeah, Alison and Boy George, very similar. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of both of them. Yeah, Yazoo's first record, one of the best synth pop records really ever. But what I want to talk about is, I think that if Boy George had been around today with modern production standards and auto-tune, we wouldn't have gotten the same Boy George necessarily, because if you listen to a lot of the notes sung on those Culture Club records, they're kind of in between. You know what I mean?
Well, there's two reasons for that. Now, yes, you're absolutely right. We didn't have auto-tune available in those days, but we had other methods of doing that should we have needed to do it. So there were already at that time processes where you could tweak it a little bit. You couldn't tweak it like you could today. And of course, everybody in those days was able to do a vocal comp. Even in those days on 24 and 48 track, I always allowed 3 or 4 tracks to do 2 or 3 takes of George and jump between them. So in fact, actually, if you look at the original multi-track of Karma Chameleon, for example, the verses are on one track and the choruses are on another, because we did a couple of different takes. Again, because George often came to the microphone with a completed idea, but once he heard it back, would perhaps change a couple of melody lines, nuance it a little bit. So very often what I would do is we would do a guide vocal when we did the backing track, of which he would then listen to it, mainly to check that we had the right number of bars. And this came about because very early on, we made a few mistakes where George would sing it to us, we'd record the track, and he'd go, no, there's another bit there. We go, well, there wasn't when we did it. Somebody added another bit. So we always then made a point of trying to do a guide vocal. And in fact, one of the greatest examples of that is Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? The vocal on that record is one take all the way through and cut with the backing track. He sang in the corridor of the studio while we did the backing track. There are no punch-ins, drop-ins, or anything on that take.
Oh my
It's a
goodness.
complete take from the very beginning to the very end. The only bit that's different is the very, very intro with the backing vocals. So we did that on a separate performance. Helen's backing vocals, because I needed all the tracks and I only had 24 track available then. So that was a separate piece, and there's an edit on the synth, on the bam, bam, and then from that point on, the vocal is complete. But George would do only maybe 3 takes, not many more than that, and we would just comp between them. And I think the blue notes that George sang are very much the style of the record, and we would work around that. Right. Again, back to when you looked back to Smokey Robinson, Eddie Kendricks, they never had those things. In fact, they didn't even have the ability to do comping because they didn't have enough tracks.
Right.
So it is true, but I've worked with George recently and since when these tools are available. And yes, we can use it now, but use it in a different way. We can actually use it to change something. I mean, he doesn't really need tuning as, a terrible singer would need tuning, but sometimes all the best singers in the world use the various tools that's available. I think it's more that each era uses the tools available to them. So if you go back to the 60s, where overdubbing was probably more prominent, you can go back to the 50s, but most of the singers in the 50s cut their vocals live with the backing track and had almost no control over it. Once we go to multi-track in the sort of early 60s, and 3 to 4, and then ultimately 8 track. That period of the 60s where people did overdub, they had a bit more control over what they were doing, but they were very good at the tools that they had available. And it was very interesting, I think, when I worked, first of all, in the studios when I started, which was the mid-70s, 16 track was prevalent then. So you very rarely had enough tracks to do 3 vocal takes and comp. What you would do though is punch in and out line by line. And it's interesting, those singers got really proficient in enabling a punch in. Whereas I would say singers today are not so good at punching in. They have to do almost a complete take and comp in between. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but punching in and making it seem like it's a seamless performance is actually quite a skill. And I would argue that the singers of that period of the 16 track moving into 24 track generation, they were able to do that because they'd learned their craft with nothing else available. Just as kids making records today have laptops and the ability to do, comping, and they're just used to doing it that way and are very good at it. So, as I said, each generation, I think, has the tools that are available to them and makes the very best use of those tools.
Yeah. And for those of our audience who have not comped on tape, it ain't always the easiest thing to do.
Well, that's why I was pleased when digital tape came through, because in the beginning, of course, as you say, with analog tape, you're going down a generation, but you'd argue going down a generation was worth it because you were creating the performance.
Of course, yeah.
But the moment we moved to digital tape, then it didn't have a generational loss.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Very good point. Okay. So what was Boy George's lead vocal mic chain for Color by Numbers?
Well, it varied very slightly, but not too much. Most of the sessions for Color by Numbers, I used the AKG tube, which I'd bought just ahead of those sessions.
As in the C12, the AKG C12.
Well, it was a reissue. No, it was, see, AKG launched a microphone called the Tube, which was kind of a bit like a C12, but it wasn't. I mean, it was essentially a C12, but it was called the Tube.
Oh.
And it was a sort of, because it wasn't using retro parts or anything like that.
Okay.
And so that was the microphone. And I've got one or two pictures of Georgie in the studio using it. We tried various mics. On the first sessions of the demos, it would have almost certainly been an 87, as most studios had that. And then towards the end of that period, as we moved towards the next period, I started to have access to some different microphones. And so some of Georgie's later vocals, I used the Sanken on, Sanken CU41. But for the majority of Color by Numbers, it was the AKG Tube. I no longer have that mic, actually. I sold that mic to Red Bus Studios because they loved the sound of it so much that they said, could we buy it off of you? So they bought it off me, and I'd moved on to different mics then. The thing that's really funny with George and that mic is that many years later, and we're talking now only a few years ago, I'm just trying to think exactly, it was maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when he was doing his solo record, he hired a similar mic. And he sent me a picture of him with the mic, and it was quite expensive per day to hire. And he said, it's taken me nearly 30-something years to realize that you were right. So I think George's vocal then, and probably now, does suit a valve, or as the Americans say, a tube microphone. I think it does suit that. However, he has got such a great tone. If you have a solid state mic like the CU41 was, and you run it through some other varying things. So for example, our chain often was at Red Bus Studios, it would have been the microphone going directly into the MCI console, using the MCI mic pre's and some of the EQ, which I love and still love.
500 series, right? This 500 series? Okay. 500.
Correct.
Right.
And it was one of the first generations of them. So it was the big MCI desk at Red Bus, as you say, the 500 series. I can't remember the exact model number of it, but it's within that series. The MCI console I loved because I grew up with MCI consoles at CBS Studios and was a real big fan of them. And because I was a younger engineer, I wasn't frightened by the inline monitoring. And I think that's one of the really important things. People that were used to using Neves or similar consoles in the late 70s, where you had microphones on your left-hand side, monitors on your right, it was pretty straightforward. When the MCI desk came in around 77, when CBS bought one, it confused a lot of older engineers because you had the inline monitoring for the first time, but you had a massive track count. You had as many, quite a lot more channels. I really loved the MCI, so I found nothing wrong with it. So consequently, when I came to use the MCI at Red Bus Studios, which is one of the reasons I used Red Bus Studios, because I loved the MCI desk and I loved the East Lake style, West Lake room style. I really liked that kind of dry sound. So it would have been the microphone going directly into the console, and then the compression would have been a 165 DBX, which is what they had, which I still use to this day. And that was pretty much it on record. And then during the mix, I would potentially add a little bit more compression, but Red Bus Studios didn't have any Fairchilds or anything like that, so I never used them. CBS Studios did have those, And I have a feeling that on the Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, which because I mixed Do You Really Want to Hurt Me at CBS Studios, it's very likely that I, on the mix, because they had some Paultex and Fairchilds there, I might have, well, not might have, I ran some elements through that because they were available. But Red Bus Studios didn't have that. They had some 1176s of a sort of mid-vintage, which were pretty good. And I would use those very often on Mikey's bass, for example. But generally speaking, the vocal chain was a DBX 165. And as I said, I have one of those in my rack today, and I still use it a lot. It's one of the best limiters, well, I think, one of the best limiters for recording vocals, because the thing about it is you can set it in a way that you're not over compressing, but if somebody warms up quite a bit and over eggs the level, it doesn't mess it up too much, because you can't keep changing all the time.
So you're using it on limit mode?
Well, I use it in both compression mode, and then I have the limit set at, say, on digital, say plus 14, plus 13. So just got a tiny bit of headroom, just in case they sort of get really overexcited with their performance.
What's the compression ratio?
And I have it, yeah, 2 to 3, no more than that. Really soft, and very often would have it on over easy. Put the button in on over easy. The only time I would change that is if I'm doing, you know, I mean, not in the case of George, but if I was working with more of a sort of hip hop or rap singer, I might, you know, do the attack myself, because you want a slower attack and a faster release. But if it's more of a general kind of pop vocal, the over easy works great.
That's great. Yeah, I just actually sold a DBX 165, so this is it's pretty funny, because I found out that was the compressor that they were using on Madonna's vocals on her first record.
Well, they were very prevalent in the studios at that time. And in fact, my DBX, I have to say, is actually a custom one, because what happened was I lived in Los Angeles for a while in the early 90s, and I was working at the Complex Studios. And as normal, I set my vocal chain up and I put the 165 in. And as I was sort of listening to the vocal, I was working with an artist, was I working with Kyle Vincent, I think, at the time. And I thought, that's interesting. That sounds really, wow. What? You know, because I've worked at Beverly Boulevard's studio, and I thought, their stuff sounds good, but the Complex, it sounds even better. Now, admittedly, they did have the famous George Massenburg mixing consoles. And I said to the engineer there, I said, how come your 165 sounds so incredible? It was like really quiet and punchy. And of course, they all vary depending on their age. You know, there's never two that are the same, but this one was pretty good. And he said, the reason is that that's not a standard 165. And I said, why? He said, well, we're very fortunate here. We've got quite a lot of George Massenburg parts, and we've put the Sontec op amps in it. So I said, wow. So, but then they said to me, well, if you can get one, we'll do it for you. And I was very fortunate. I phoned up one of the Los Angeles audio retailers, the professional retailers. And I said, have you got any 165s left? Because bearing in mind, this was now a discontinued item. And he said, well, Steve, you'll never believe it. I've got a brand new one in the box. It's never been used. It's like new old stock. He said, I can do a deal for you. So I bought a brand new DBX 165 in 1991, had it modified by the tech team at the Complex, which I still have to this day. So I've got as close to what they had as possible. So it's essentially a DBX 165 with the Sontec block in it. Although the ones I used at Red Bus were very similar to the ones I would have used at Westlake Audio and Beverly Boulevard and so on and so forth. They're pretty much the standard unit.
Okay, fascinating. I sold my 165, and now I have a couple of 160 VUs and also a 162, which is the stereo, basically 160. I don't know what your feelings are on those, but
I'm a big DBX fan. I've got in my rack, I've also got some of the 500 series DBX over easy compressor. I've got a couple of those, and I also have the DBX voice strip, which is an incredibly brilliant and yet flawed product. When I first got it, I have to be honest, incredibly disappointed with it. The noise was appalling. And I thought, this is really odd. How can something, because it's an expensive piece of equipment. And I did a little bit of research, and I found a company in England that made really good high fidelity tubes that were really not expensive, and we're talking like $30 rather than. And the problem is that a lot of this current manufacturing that's done in China, whilst the boards are great, the finishing is great, they put these really, shitty tubes in that cost $1, and they're not very good. And so I changed the tube for the exact same specification, but an audiophile version of them. I can't remember the brand. It might have been Dragon, but it's one of the ones that's like the higher end cost. The difference was honestly, Tyler, remarkable. It was unbelievable. It was like night and day.
Yeah.
And consequently, I love it to bits because it's got two brilliant features on it. You've got the preamp, and then you've got the output drive. So you can overdrive the front end and turn down the output. Right. So you can get really, really nice saturation within the unit.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I seem to be a fan of DBX as well. One more question about Boy George's lead vocals. When you're tracking them through the MCI 500 series EQ, were you using a high pass filter, and where were you using it if you were?
Yes, because the microphone didn't have one.
Okay.
So probably around 75, kind of the same that you would use if it was a Neumann.
Right. Okay. Okay. And then what about Helen Terry's vocal chain? Was it the same thing?
Yes, it was exactly the same chain, and essentially the vocal mic was pretty much set up all the time. So the only difference would have been her level, but because she was tending to be much more multi-tracked, I'd have to maybe look at how much compression I used, and maybe when I bounced down, say she did 6 vocals or 8 vocals, I would probably filter out a little bit more low end as well, because obviously the room sound when you're doing 6 to 8 tracks starts to get a bit sort of so I would put another filter in just to clean that low end up a little bit.
Okay. And then how many passes was she generally doing before you mixed down?
She would do between 6 and 8 on each part.
Oh, wow. And so, wow, so you had to do the backing vocals at the beginning of the tracking then, basically?
No, I used to use separate tapes. I had work tapes for everything, because even though we were on 24 track, we were able to link 2 machines. And so actually the album became 48 track in the end, because I started it as a 24 track, but we immediately were able to go to 48 track because Reverbs had 2 machines and we could lock them together. It was actually an MCI machine and a Studio machine, so they weren't 2 the same, which did cause a few problems on some of the tracks just with the sync because of the way the code was. But essentially I would record the backing track, do a stereo mix of that, but on a synchronized piece of tape. Then that would effectively give me 20 something tracks, because I needed obviously the stereo mix, I needed a code track for the 2 machines, and I also in some cases kept a code track for the Lindrum, and right, sometimes a code track for the sequencer. So I would be using 5 tracks ish. It really depended on the song. Minimum of 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 tracks for tech use. Then the process would be as follows: record her vocals across the remaining tracks, which then did give me plenty of tracks. So I would do, if it was, say it's a 3-part harmony, we'd track up the 6 or 8 parts, and the varying was only really how thick we wanted it. So did we want, double track left, double track center, double track right, giving you 6, which is most of the time. And then sometimes I wanted 8 because I put 2 in between. I would do those, and then I'd bounce that to a stereo pair, and then she'd do the next part and next part. And then depending on how she was working the parts out, rather than waste time, I would either bounce when she'd gone, or if she needed to hear it there and then. So some of the more complex stuff that was maybe 4 or even 5 parts, I would probably bounce as we go so she could hear it. So we do the normal, the melody. Very often she'd do the melody as well. Melody, 3rd, 5th, bounce those down. Then we do an octave of that, bounce those down. She'd hear that and go, okay, I can find one more here. So then I'd end up with, let's say, 4 stereo tracks of the harmonies. Right. I would then mix that to a stereo track.
Oh, okay.
And I'd mix that to a piece of analog tape, as it was on Color by Numbers, and then manually fly them in. And we did that. We found it much quicker because the machines in those days didn't chase very quickly. So it was really painful to do them locked. It was much quicker to mark the tape with a China graph, count the bars and go 1, 2, 3, play, and you get it right most of the time.
So you're saying you would mix those down to a mixdown deck?
Yeah, a 1/2-inch piece of tape, and then spin them back. Yeah, and then spin them back into the original master.
Okay.
It did depend on the track and how complicated it was. But one of the things that's really noticeable or really important why we did do that was that if you specifically, now I need people to listen to the track again with what I'm about to tell you. If you listen to Chameleon actually slightly speeds up.
I was going to ask you about that. Hey, that's interesting.
Right. Now, even though it was done with a Lindrum, it slightly speeds up because we made a slight error. Now, one of the things that's quite difficult with, or was quite difficult with drum machines then, was time signatures that were different to 4/4. They would do them, but it was complicated. And technically speaking, Chameleon is kind of in 2/4, not 4/4. But we recorded it in 4/4, but with the tempo really high. What I didn't appreciate was when the tempo was very high, the accuracy of the code wasn't so good. And in fact, what actually happened was once we programmed the part and got it right, what we would tend to do was put the code on tape, run the drum machine, on separate tracks. I'd have kick, snare, hi-hat, claps, whatever, and then John would overdub what was needed. But for some reason, I think Mikey wanted to get on with the bass. I didn't check. What I would often do is press play and then press play again and check that it was in sync. And every time, by the way, on these older machines, you couldn't punch in halfway through. You had to play from the top. The code only started at the beginning of the song. You couldn't chase anything.
Right.
Anyway, Mikey did the bass and we put some overdubs on it. Roy did the guitars and we thought, oh, great, we've got a good backing track. And we were fine. It was only when I then tried to do the backing vocals, I realized that it got slightly faster and faster as it went through, which ironically is brilliant, of course.
It is, yeah.
Because it makes the song have pace. The problem was we recorded the vocals on chorus 2, and that meant that as I listened back to it, they didn't fit on the other chorus exactly. So that's why, if you listen very carefully, each chorus, we use that little slight gap before, so that I would press go on the tape a bit. So that's why it goes, because I needed to use that tiny little bit of, a quarter of a beat. It's only a tiny bit, I can't remember what the tempo is, but let's say it goes from 130 to 132. It's not like, 130 to 190. It's not that fast, but it's just enough that it screwed up the being able to lay the vocals right back in absolutely accurately. And this was just before I had the AMS. This is one of the reasons why I was prompted to ultimately get the AMS, because I ended up with an AMS with 26 seconds in it, so that I could fire them up mathematically, which was much better because I could put a click on the track, or I could use my Fairlight to put, click on bar X, and then it would fire them up. Again, because synchronization in those days didn't chase like it does now. Not that anyone's using analog tape in that way anymore, but in those days, chasing in real time like that,
right? No,
as opposed to doing a mix. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, let me just make sure so our audience understands this. So when you did these huge stacked backing vocals and you have 3 choruses, instead of doing for every chorus, you would put them on 1/2-inch tape and then just fly them over manually, right? Correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it would be way too much work. But then once you got the AMS DMX 15, you were able to just sample them in, or you could even do it on Fairlight at a certain point in time, or if you had a Synclavier, you could probably do the same thing.
No, I couldn't do it on the Fairlight audio wise. I used the Fairlight as the trigger, because the audio quality, because the first Fairlight was only 8-bit, and the vocals degenerated too much. The AMS, the vocal quality was absolutely exactly the same.
Wow.
All I used was a trigger to trigger the vocals, and then they came in when I wanted. But having said that, the AMS was only mono, not stereo. So it meant that I had to be very careful on how I did it, because it wasn't phase locked. So I had to sort of kind of choose very carefully which vocals I did do with that. And that didn't happen on Color by Numbers. All of Color by Numbers was multi-track, stereo mix, second tape, stacked vocals, 1/2-inch tape, back in.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The 2 multi-tracks, that you were using, you said it was a Studer and MCI. Which models?
A800 on the Studer and the standard JH24 on the MCI.
And which do you like the sound of better?
They were both exactly the same. There was a slight difference, but I wouldn't say that it impeded my workflow. I didn't have to say, oh, I'm only doing that on the Studer, I'm only doing that on the MCI.
Okay, and this was
the only thing I'd argue, actually, having said that, the only thing that was much better on the MCI was the punching in and out.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because I have an A800 in my studio, and I like the sound of that machine. I haven't used the MCI that much, and I've never personally used it, only with another engineer. What were you 30 IPS for this record, I'm guessing?
Yeah.
Okay, and then were you using noise reduction at all?
Yes.
So Dolby A? Yeah. Okay, very cool. And what tape formula were you using, if you remember?
Unfortunately, 456.
Oh, okay, and it was falling apart in those days, right?
Well, no, it wasn't falling apart in those days, and thank Christ it's been copied across. The majority, you've got to remember, 456 was the best tape to use at the time.
Okay, then
it sounded better. It was much more reliable. It's only when it was stored 30 years on that we realized there was a problem. At the time, there was no problem.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And would that have been the modern equivalent of +3 that you were hitting, or what kind of?
Yeah.
Okay, I heard that this record, correct me if I'm wrong, was mixed to 2-track digital.
It was mixed to F1 digital. You're absolutely correct, because I just had an F1 and I used to mix to 30 IPS half-inch, and I just bought the F1 and we did an A/B between the two. In fact, the first one I mixed was actually Time Clock of the Heart, so that's when I had the machine. So Time Clock of the Heart I mixed to F1, and we went, wow, that sounds really good. So all of Color by Numbers was mixed onto F1, and actually, interestingly enough, I didn't even bother to back it up. When I did Time, there is a mix on half-inch and a mix on F1, but and I can't remember which way round. I do remember though, when we did the box set, we did use the half-inch because thank goodness the tape was in good condition. But all of Color by Numbers absolutely was mixed to F1. There was no backup. I just mixed it to F1, and then we transferred it to a U-matic for duplication.
Okay, and
in fact, so much so, an interesting story was there wasn't a backup of it, and at one point when I went to AdVision to do the transfer, the tape got caught in the machine, and guy had to unscrew the top to take it out, which was fun. But yeah, it was all on F1, and I think it sounds fabulous.
It really does, and it's funny because my first interview actually was with Elliot Shiner and for Gaucho. I don't know if you know the Steely Dan record Gaucho from 1980.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, amazing audiophile record, just like this. And
Hey 19 being the first use of the Wendell drum machine.
Bingo. And so they mixed it to half-inch initially, because this was 1980 when it came out. So they were working in the late 70s here. There was no F1, and Roger Nichols thankfully backed up the half-inch tapes in the early 80s to the F1. And so the late 90s CD master of Gauchos sourced from those F1 masters because they sounded better than the tapes, which had gone bad by the late 90s. And it sounds so good. And it's funny because we think early digital, oh, it sounds terrible. Oh, it's awful. But then you listen to something like Color by Numbers of Gaucho and you're like, man, this sounds unbelievably good.
But the simple answer is, who was the F1? This is where people get muddled with things. Who was the F1 aimed at? Hi-fi enthusiasts. It was designed as an audiophile product. So for the time, there was no expense spared on the converters. The only thing that was consumer was the mechanism to put the tape in. When people say, oh, it's a Betamax, yes, it was a Betamax because they used that as the delivery method. But the box that went with it that had the A to D and D to A conversion in it was the highest quality that was available at that time. It was also a really expensive piece of kit for the time. It was the same price as a brand new reel-to-reel professional machine, like a Studer A80 or something like that. It was a really, I think it was I can't remember exactly the price, but I think it was certainly in pounds, a couple of £1,000s in 1982. It was really expensive,
right?
for what it was, but was fantastic. And in fact, at the time, I A/B'd the F1 between a 1610, and to me, the F1 sounded better than the first generation of 1610. They immediately improved it with the 1630, and I would say the 1630 probably was better. But the 1610 versus the F1 sounded better. And I think the reason it sounded better was it was designed for hi-fi use, and so perhaps had an element of coloring on it, which was great. I mean, if what goes in and what comes out you like, then that's the end of the answer.
Right. I mean, if this was beating out a half-inch machine for mixdown, first of all, which half-inch machine was it beating out? We got to ask that question.
It would have been the MCI.
Okay, which is a good sounding half-inch machine, electronics-wise, for sure. I mean, it kind of begs the question in terms of the modern day. Would it be foolish for someone in the modern day to mix down to 1644 on a Sony F1 through a console?
Well, I think possibly not. And I think that it's interesting how, yes, they have a sound, and we are dealing with higher bit rates now, but some of the new Eurorack stuff is using that era of technology. I've just got a Eurorack sampler that uses 44.1 16-bit technology because that has a sound. So as I said earlier, each generation uses the best they have in the tools for the job. And for us, we were all through the Culture Club period. The very first album was 24-track analog and analog mix. The second album became 48-track analog with F1 mix. The third album became 100% digital. As the technology changed, we used the best that was available to us. And every generation does exactly the same.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of fascinated with some of this incipient digital technology from the early 80s. It really does have a sound. And I will say to the viewers out there too, the best listening experience I have to this day is my Sony D303 Discman, which came out in 1991, has no skip protection. It's really quite a fickle device in a way, but the sound quality, it blows away their modern digital Walkman, which cost me like $1,200. Blows it away. It's just something about the electronics. I don't know if it's something. Okay. What were the main keyboards and synthesizers being used on this record?
On the Color by Numbers album,
yeah,
most of it was OB8, a large chunk of it. Any bass sounds were Mini Moog, and then a few other elements were Prophet 5.
Okay, and were you using Fairlight for any of this stuff?
And towards the end, yes. Not right at the very, very beginning, but towards the end. Because actually in the beginning, the Fairlight wasn't available, and but we did use it towards the end. And I had an emulator as well. But during the course of that record, the famous DX7 came out. So that's why the B-side of Karma Chameleon was done live, because I was able to get hold of a DX7 for the weekend. So the DX sounds started to make their way through, but the majority of what we love on there is OB8 and Prophet 5.
Okay, and speaking of that B-side, I'm guessing you're referring to the song Color by Numbers. Okay, so that is my favorite song from the entire Color by Numbers sessions, I should say. That's my favorite song from the entire thing, and it was left off of the album. It was
done as a B-side, and it was done as one take.
I mean, it's such a magical song. I think I heard somewhere that it was the first use of DX7 in a commercial pop song.
That's absolutely true, because the company that supplied my OB8, a company in London called Chase Music, that's what I said, they had not a prototype, it was like the first, very, very first dealer release of the machine. And he said to me, look, I'll bring it around on Friday. And I remember it being a bank holiday weekend in England. So that was the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. He said, you can have it for the weekend, but I've got to have it back on Tuesday morning. So you're absolutely correct.
Amazing. So why? I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that song. I personally believe it's arguably the best ballad Culture Club ever did, along with Mistake Number 3 and Victims. I mean, I guess you could say, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me as a ballad in a way, but I mean, what are your thoughts on that song? Because I am in love with that song. I mean, incredible production, incredible vocal, beautiful, beautiful songwriting. What are your thoughts?
I love it, but it was done as a B-side bonus track because, again, you've got to remember how things were back then. People wanted to put additional tracks on either the B-side or, if you were lucky enough to have a 3-track 12-inch, unique things that absolutely intentionally never appeared on the album. It was very much the thing. You look at many bands of that era, and That was what people were doing. These were bonus tracks that would only be available in those days in that one form, the B-side of that single. Later on, of course, it becomes available on compilation albums, but at the time, it made it a unique thing. In fact, we've almost gone back to that now. When you think of record store day reissues and things like that, people are making tracks that will now only be available in that one thing.
Right. Okay, so that makes sense. Gosh, I think so many people didn't hear that B-side though that should have. And I look on Spotify at the play count for the Colored by Numbers ballad. It's pretty low compared to the other songs. And anyway, just a beautiful, beautiful track. So how much of the keyboard parts were sequenced and how much were hand played?
That's hard to know as an exact percentage. A large number was sequenced because I had the Oberheim sequencer to go with it. I didn't get the Prophet 5 sequencer until towards the end. In the beginning, oddly enough, on the first album, almost all of them were sequenced because I had a Roland sequencer. I would say a large number, but the sequences in those days were performance sequences that you corrected. So even towards the end, when I had the Roland MSQ, Roy would play a part in. We'd listen back to it and go, no, we'll do it again, and then you just shift it or time correct it. So it's not like a sequencer today, and they're not an electronic band, so it wasn't like it was like tick 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 tick. It wasn't that. They were polyphonic parts, and the reason that we sequenced them was not so much because we couldn't play them, it was because we wanted to layer them, and by sequencing them, and this was just as MIDI was beginning to become more usable, because again, in the very beginning, MIDI didn't exist, and then MIDI was added to most of these keyboards. That's why, again, the DX was so incredible, because it was designed with MIDI from the beginning. So a lot of the sequencing was done so that I could layer things, and indeed, even the mini-moog parts were done using my CSQ sequencer, so that I could layer the parts.
Okay. Did you have any mix bus processing, compression, EQ limiting when you're?
No, I never did that, and I still don't do much of that.
Okay,
it's just not the way that I work.
Of course. And this was tracked and mixed on an MCI 500 series. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that's the same console that was used for the Human League's Dare. Martin Rushent swore by that console.
Well, as I said, I swore by them. I grew up on them as a young engineer, and I loved them to bits. I love the EQ. I still love them. I still think it's a real shame that there's not anyone out there. Actually, there's one company I think that has made a hardware emulation of it. It's quite pricey, but
right.
Just it's amazing that there isn't the sort of, there's a lot of Pultec and Neve clones that get you that sound at a lower price point. I'm surprised there isn't one. There's PSP make a very good plugin that's very, very close, called Mc EQ, which is pretty close to it, actually. Okay,
good to know. What digital effects were being used on this record? I'm particularly curious about like the vocal reverb. Were there any plates, real plates being used? Was it mostly?
Yes, so it's a combination. So again, it was a very fortunate time. The AMS stuff had come through, so the majority was AMS reverb, AMS digital delay, using it in the pitch changing mode. I also had access to the plates that Reverbs had. They had actual proper EMT plates of various vintages, and those were available to all the studios. So some things were plate, but the majority was AMS reverb, the majority.
And which patch on that?
It varied from, for example, the non-linear on some of the drums through to some of the plates. And in fact, if you have the UAD plugin of the AMS, which sounds absolutely exactly the same as the original. I've done some of George's settings on there that says BG vocal or something. And the reason I was very fortunate is that for some reason, and I don't know why, on the track split, I'd written down the settings. So I was able to recreate the settings absolutely. And Mark Crabtree from AMS says that the UAD plugin of the AMS is absolutely bit for bit the same. So if you have that plugin and my settings, it's the same.
We have a real one in the studio, so I would love to know your settings at some point.
Well, if you load in the software one and copy the settings down,
I don't even have the software one. I gotta look that up.
But they are exactly the same. And I've actually had two very famous artists sent me Twitter pictures who have endorsed how great it sounds.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'd love to know. Okay, so mostly AMS. I've used that reverb a lot too. I really like the Hall setting, which is patch number 3. Yeah, Hall number 3.
But I would customize the settings for each track.
Okay,
specifically. Okay. The two things I loved customizing was, of course, the pre-delay time, which makes sense bearing on the tempo of the track, and also the decay time. So a lot of the settings were custom for each track. And also, luckily, I don't know, it was just a thing I did. I printed the reverb on most of the tracks I used on. And the reason for that was I only had one AMS. So if I wanted it on the vocal and the drums on everything, so I'd have to print it. So the good thing about that, it meant that my multi-track sounds almost like the record. The bad thing, which I'm pleased about, it means it's really hard for anyone to remix it because that's the way it sounds.
Right. So what would be your average pre-delay time? Do you like these really long pre-delay times, or what's your thing with that?
No, I'm a fan, as I mentioned before, a big fan of Philadelphia music. So it's, like depending on the tempo, it's normally a 16th, something like that.
Okay. Was there any automation used on this record?
Yep, we used the inbuilt desk automation, which again uses 2 tracks.
Okay, and that's just to like mute tracks and keep the noise floor low and stuff, or was it actually
correct?
Okay. Was Victims actually tracked live?
No.
Okay.
It was still, well, what it was tracked was the piano and vocal tracked live. To not to a click. So what happened was we tried to do the track, and if anyone's listened to the box set, you can hear how the band sounded when they were trying to track it live. It became a nightmare. It fell apart with arguments. So later on that evening, George asked me to get my friend Julian to come down and play piano. So we played piano and vocal live, did a couple of takes, got the take we wanted, and then the next day said to everybody, ta-da, here's the vocal and here's the piano. But we didn't do it to a click or anything. So poor John had to then play, which is why in that middle, the drum fill goes boom, 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 because obviously the tempo is all over the place. But once again, moving tempos can be incredibly emotional. And it is so in that song. Yeah,
I mean, amazing recording. What was your mixing process like? Did you do the rhythm section first, that kind of thing? Is it drums and bass first, or what's your process?
Just push all the faders up and move them around, and then I might solo a few things. But it's something I say to my students when I have students in the studio. If you want to get rid of a manager or somebody from a session, just solo the kick drum for about 10 minutes and sit there EQing it. They'll soon leave the room. I think it's a very dangerous process to listen in solo to one item for hours on end. I just listen to the whole thing and move things up and down and change things. And then if I think, actually, the drums are sounding good now, I might solo the drums for a minute and just double check things. But I think it's a real mistake to just start with the kick drum and then keep building everything up. I think it's a poor way of mixing.
How much high pass filtering were you doing in the mix?
None after I'd recorded it, because I'm very much a recording person, so I would have added that. And again, as I mentioned before, when I would be bouncing things down, that's when I would do things like that, so that then that stereo track was complete, and then it was just pushing the fader up.
Okay. And what parts of the record were tracked in stereo?
As many things as possible.
Interesting.
So from synthesizers, because on the OB8, for example, there was an option to pan the voices, so that when you played a chord, or if I was using the AMS as I just described in the stereo mode, I might have the dry in the center, and that a lot of Roy's guitars were done with the Roland Jazz Chorus amplifier, so that would have been recorded in stereo as well.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I mean, it's a very wide sounding record. So
yeah, as much as possible is recorded in stereo, hence needing 48 tracks. It's kind of like a stereo 24 track.
Right. For synthesizer recording, were you just generally putting the DI into the console preamp, or
Yeah.
what? Okay.
Yeah. Because most of those things in those days did require DI boxes. Very few were coming out. I think it's possible, actually, when I first used the DX7, that might have been the very first time that a synthesizer had a proper line out. Up until then, most synthesizers did not only balance better, but they sounded better through a DI box. And I'm fairly certain that Red Bus would have had, they either had EMS or Countryman DI boxes, so just the standard stuff. Later on, I bought one of those Axe DI boxes, but I don't think I had it for those sessions.
Okay. Well, what was it like working on this album? Was it fun? Was it really hectic? I mean, obviously there was a lot of bickering going on between John and Boy George, but what was it like?
I've spoken to Roy. I spoke to Roy only a couple of days ago. We have fond memories of it. Yes, it was tough, but bearing in mind, our bickering was because we all wanted to do the best job we possibly could. Mm. So, and also don't forget, unusually, we came into this album off the back of 2 hits and almost a 3rd hit by the time we got into our stride, because Do You Really Want to Hurt Me had already been a hit. Time Clock of the Heart was already a hit. Mm. And Church of the Poison Mind, which was beginning, that was like the first batch of recordings we did. So, we were a hit band. So there's nothing better than being a hit band making a record.
Wow, that's awesome. Were drugs a big thing? Alcohol?
0, 0, 0. It's really interesting. It was really, really clean.
Amazing. That's right. I had heard that Boy
George, because you've got to. Yeah, but George's problems came well after Culture Club had finished.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because he was clean in the early '80s, and then the mid '80s was when he started having problems.
Yeah, everyone was. I mean, George didn't smoke. John Moss was the only one that smoked cigarettes, and that was it. And I can't remember if Roy smoked and gave up. But yeah, it was very, very, clean living and free, and tea and coffee maybe, but that's about it.
And alcohol wasn't an issue for anybody?
No, not at all.
Wow,
no.
That's incredible. So Jermaine Stewart, I saw, was a backing vocalist on the record. What's the story there?
He only sings on Miss Me Blind.
Oh, okay.
That's the only track. So here's the thing. When we did the backing track to Miss Me Blind, we thought it sounded a bit like Shalimar. Just because Shalimar were a big band, and completely randomly, I had a meeting with Jeffrey Daniels because he wanted me to produce a record with him. And somehow, some way, Mikey bumped into Jermaine Stewart at a club or something. And for those that don't know, and it's not really giving anything away, but Jermaine Stewart is actually the vocal sound of Shalimar. If you listen to Night to Remember, for example, that high vocal is Jermaine Stewart. It's not Jody Watley. Although Jody Watley can sing, and Howard Hewitt, of course, has got the most tremendous vocal, the block of vocals that you hear on that big block of Shalimar records, the really big hits, Night to Remember, There It Is, and all those, Jermaine Stewart is actually a really integral tone in that chorus. Listen again to Night to Remember and kind of zoom your mind into it, and you'll hear the very high vocal. That's Jermaine Stewart, not anyone else from the band. I think that's to get a sonic balance, because I said, both Jody and Jermaine and Howard Hewitt got tremendous. I mean, Howard Hewitt's got one of the greatest vocals of all, but it's a blend. It's not because they couldn't sing. It's I guess Leon Silvers wanted a sound that was a different blend. So we wanted that sound, and so we got Jermaine to do the vocals on Miss Me Blind. So it'd be kind of Culture Club's homage to the sound of Shalimar. And wow. I think it worked quite well.
Yeah.
That's the only track he's singing on.
Okay. How aware were you that Boy George and John Moss were romantically involved at the time?
From day one.
Okay, so that was very obvious. I wasn't sure if that was something that was hidden at all. until later. Who was the primary songwriter musically in the band, if there was one?
Well, I think this is the thing. It was the sum of the parts. Of course, George said, I've got a bit, it goes like this, and he'd stand in front of us and sing it. But then Roy was very good at interpreting his bit and then turning it into something. But then Mikey absolutely, would go, well, look, I've got this, bass line thing. So it's really hard to set. And I think their first really big hit, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, is exactly the sum of the pieces. Listen to that record again. Listen to Mikey's bass line, how integral that is.
Yeah, it's an amazing bass line.
The song. Listen to George's vocal, how it lilts against the drum rhythm. That's absolutely crucial. Listen to both Roy's guitar and my little rubbishy keyboard. Those are really integral parts, really integral parts. Even my silly little string thing at the beginning, that thing goes, but they're really, really important little parts. So it's the sum of the pieces that make that record. And that's what the blueprint of the Culture Club writing is. It's the sum of the parts. So they all have a responsibility in making those songs that shape the way they are.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We're almost done here. Are there any other crazy stories you wish to share from the record, or anything else?
You've hit on most of them. I can't think of any that. Yeah. I mean, I applaud people to listen to the box sets and the various things. So there's always little hidden gems on those things.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Well, I really enjoy these records. I think Waking Up with a House on Fire, for all digital, to think about how incredibly well mixed that record is. I know it didn't maybe have the song firepower of some of the previous records, but amazing mixed job you did on that for sure. And Mistake Number 3, in my opinion, one of the best.
Mistake Number 3 is I've got a couple of favorites through the various blocks of records, and Mistake Number 3 is definitely one of my favorites on that. I also think that The Dive is a really underrated record on Waking Up. There's some great moments. I think the problem with the third album was, of course, times move on. And I think that Culture Club were beginning to be slightly behind the curve, where we were absolutely ahead of the curve.
Right.
And there's new bands coming through every minute. Most bands are lucky if they make one decent record today. We made 3 decent records. The band made a 4th album afterwards, which is okay. I mean, it's good, but I think that it's sort of the curve's doing that.
Right.
The big hit that they had later, I Just Want to Be Loved, was actually written in the last stages of the original session. So although that was a new record, it was actually quite an old song.
Oh, that was written in the mid-80s?
It was written in around, I would say, I've got a date of it, I'd say 89, 90, no more than that. 89, 88, 89. I'm just trying to think exactly.
I was thinking, if that had come out during the Colored by Numbers era, that would have been
It wasn't written then. No, it was after that. It wasn't written then.
Yeah, I was just saying,
but it certainly wasn't written. Yeah, it wasn't written in the late 90s when it came out. It was. But yeah, hey, that's really sick.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you being willing to do this interview with me and share all this information with the world. And it's important information because it's a really important record, and these are very important artists. So, and you did one heck of a job on these first 3 records here. So, thank you so much, Steve.
And thank you. And fingers crossed it all gets good and edited. And keep me posted, and I'll retweet it and everything.
All right. Thanks a lot.